Hello there, welcome to my review of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, Episode 2, The Dying Detective. The episode begins with a young woman asleep in bed as a man writes a note for her before leaving it and a string of pearls on her dressing table. He seems tormented as he sneaks off in the light of dawn. We soon find out this is Adelaide and Victor Savage. Adelaide demands to know where Victor has gone, but her cousin-in-law, Culverton Smith, feigns ignorance.
Where's Victor gone?
Victor?
Please do not pretend you are ignorant of where he is.
Am I my cousin's keeper?
Which Adelaide does not buy for a second.
I should be obliged if you would tell me where he has gone. I know what he's gone to do. Where has he gone?
There's clearly a lot of tension between all three parties here, as Culverton hints at his jealousy over Victor's life before leaving.
I pity for you. At Summerley House with your lovely children, the love you have for each other.
We get a lot of information here in short order, but also it leaves a lot of mystery. Victor, played by a young Hugh Bonneville, is clearly up to something as he sneaks off, but he's clearly not leaving his wife based on the gift he leaves her and her reaction the next day. Adelaide, played by Susanna Harker, clearly has some idea of what he's up to, but disapproves and blames his cousin Culverton for whatever trouble Victor is getting himself into. And cousin Culverton is clearly very shifty. Not just because of how he acts, but because he's played by Jonathan Hyde, who has played so many shifty roles that if he ever played a hero, he might have to be credited as Jonathan Jekyll. We then cut to Watson arriving at Baker Street after a brief holiday, as Holmes observes Adelaide pacing about the street, deducing that she plans to consult with him but is hesitant.
That woman is undoubtedly coming here. She's been staring up at this window for the past 3 minutes. Oh, I do wish she'd make up her mind.
We then cut to a dive bar where Mr. John Gedgrave, played by the legendary Roy Hudd, meets with Victor and they arrange some private business.
And 3 for the establishment, 5 in total.
If it's worth it.
Oh, anonymous was the word you used.
Back at Baker Street, Adelaide has worked up the nerve to see Holmes and we intercut between her and Victor. She explains he is a banker but wishes to become a poet and has taken to opium to heighten his talent, which has led to him becoming an opium addict, retreating to an opium den. She suspects Culverton has driven him to be an opium fiend for his own ends.
Culverton Smith.
Victor's cousin. He has a malign influence. I am sure he has driven Victor to this.
Holmes takes the case, but is not sure if it will come to anything, as Culverton is an amateur scientist who made some important discoveries in the East and is being financially burdened by professional scientists, not the usual sort of rogue that Sherlock encounters, but merely someone literally doing their own research. At the Savage's mansion, Holmes and Watson arrive at a dinner party, followed by Smith, who introduces himself.
Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Culverton Smith. Dear Adelaide promised me a surprise guest. Someone of your distinction I'd not expected at all.
At the dinner party, Holmes carefully observes all the guests, including how Victor seems to be suffering from a fever. Victor seems to rally as the men engage in party games, while the women wisely stay away. As the women go to join the men, Adelaide is disturbed by one of her children, telling her that their father seems very sick, which Holmes overhears, and as she joins the rest of the group, Victor collapses, dying in hospital just a short time later. Holmes questions Smith about Victor's death, and Smith claims it may be Sumatran river fever, picked up from the opium den. But considering we're nearly halfway through and Smith has been pretty clearly set up as the villain, you'd have to be pretty naive to believe he's not more directly involved. What I like about the structure of this episode is that it's set up as a series of little mysteries that are fairly quickly resolved, while providing hints as to what is really going on, although not necessarily why. We find out that Victor is an opium addict who sneaks away from his wife to score because he knows she disapproves, but clearly he still loves her and she loves him. Something we've seen before in The Man with the Twisted Lip. But there's also the complication of Smith, an expert in tropical diseases who Adelaide blames for her husband's addiction. We are very much keeping pace with Holmes here and seeing the story almost entirely from his perspective, and I really enjoy when the series does this with the episode. As Holmes researches tropical diseases, Watson and Adelaide discover through a quirk of the estate will that Culverton is due to inherit the entirety of the Savage's fortune, leaving Adelaide with a modest allowance, but not home or possessions.
I must leave Summerley.
As soon as will is proved, Calverton Smith is within his rights to ask you to go.
Holmes engages the Baker Street irregulars before consulting with a pathologist, who was unable to find any obvious means for a transmission of the disease apart from a small insect bite. The irregulars have tracked down Gedgrave, who explains he was hired to escort Victor around the opium dens, but he does not know who his employer was. Watson explains the situation with the will, but Holmes is unwilling to take it as any more than coincidence. While this might seem somewhat out of character for Holmes to be slow and for Watson to be ahead of him, that's not actually what's going on here. When Holmes exclaims it to be a coincidence, what he means is that this is how it appears in a legal sense. While all the circumstantial evidence points to Smith, none of it means anything without hard evidence. While circumstantial evidence is often enough to convict, despite what some TV shows claim, there has to at least be firm evidence that a crime has been committed. And here, Holmes realises there is none. Holmes continues to downplay the evidence to Watson while accompanying him to make sure he doesn't get into too much trouble.
You've already had your head turned. I must make sure you don't get your neck broken as well.
Adelaide is suffering from grief and understandable stress as Watson arrives to comfort her. This seems to spark inspiration in Holmes, and he loudly proclaims to Smith that he suspects him of murder and will do all in his power to destroy Smith.
The doors of your profession, which have been closed to you, will now be locked.
It's here we see the differences and similarities between Holmes and Watson writ large. They have both come to the conclusion that Smith is guilty, Holmes having reasoned his way there, while Watson seems to be working from a gut reaction. They both plan to do something about it, Holmes having carefully thought it out, while Watson is acting on impulse, and they are both doing it due to how they feel for Adelaide. Watson happy to wear his heart on his sleeve, while Holmes pretends to be acting without emotion. The difference is that Holmes understands exactly how dangerous Smith is, and his actions are also to protect Watson from Smith. As Watson gives money to Adelaide to help her get by, Holmes is taken ill, seemingly from the same illness that killed Victor. Watson is unable to help, partly because Holmes won't let him, and partly because the only expert is Culverton Smith. Watson eventually suggests that he get Smith, and Holmes agrees. Smith is naturally reluctant after their encounter, but agrees, acting apparently magnanimously.
I will come with you at once.
I have another appointment.
Very well, I shall go alone.
Watson gives Holmes the news that Smith is on his way, and Holmes asks him to leave. As Smith arrives, Holmes begs Watson to hide before Smith gets in. Upon Smith's arrival, Holmes appears to be getting worse, fatally worse, and in his decline, Smith happily confesses to having murdered his cousin, purposely infecting him with the disease. He also gleefully explains to Holmes that he is responsible for Sherlock's current condition, having sent him a package with tainted tacks on it. Holmes begs him to turn up the lights as Smith collects the package, the only evidence linking him to Holmes' situation. As Holmes rises and lights a cigarette, now a full picture of health.
3 days without food and water is one thing, but to be without tobacco I have found most irksome.
And calls for the police, who are waiting outside, with Watson acting as witness. This is a fantastic episode based on a fantastic story, one that develops in front of us and makes it clear we know who the villain is and how difficult it will be to catch him. While it is perfectly plausible to guess how it's going to turn out, it's not a certainty, and there are a few different ways the story could have gone, although Holmes actually dying was perhaps the least likely scenario. They do a really good job of establishing how it's impossible to catch Smith and why Holmes does all he can to stop Watson doing anything silly. Although it feels like there's a scene missing between Watson consoling Adelaide and Holmes confronting Smith, as Watson quickly gives up on his idea to search Smith's house. That's a minor complaint though, as I think this episode does everything else brilliantly well, particularly Holmes faking his illness, which is done entirely via Brett's performance and is entirely believable. This is easily a 5 out of 5 for me. Thank you. Goodbye.